Now I want to compare the Goldman Sachs bond with the William S. Hart California bonds. I can't for the life of me remember what the REF stands for, but it's something I should know and just can't think of at the moment. But these bonds are very similar in certain ways and quite different in other ways. First, they have identical coupon rates, 5%. So this particular bond, it's not a corporate bond, it's actually a government bond, but let's pretend it's also got a par value of $1,000. So if you bought this bond, you'd also get $4.16 a month, just like with this Goldman Sachs bond. And then at maturity, which happens to also be in September 2025. Now, this is September the 1st, whereas this one's September the 15th. That's a 2-week difference. That's not that big of a deal. Um, I would still consider these almost identical. And then at maturity you'd get the $1,000 principal amount. But they differ in the other respects. First, the William S. Hart bond has a much, much higher price than the Goldman Sachs bond. And the main reason for that, since they're paying the same coupon rate, they have the same par value, they have essentially the same maturity date, the main reason for that is the rating. Now, the rating isn't that different. It's a double A for the William S. Hart bond and a single A for the Goldman Sachs. But let's pop back over. Hopefully I still have that table open. So a double A here and a single A, that's actually a difference of a few tiers. And so that's a fairly different degree of risk. The double A bond is almost what they would consider um, very high quality. Actually, they are saying it's very high quality because they just put their ditto quotation marks there. So the double A is still considered high quality, whereas the single A is only medium quality, although it's upper medium quality. So a fair degree of risk difference between the double A and the single A ratings. That's why the William S. Hart bond is so much more expensive than the Goldman Sachs bond. Remember, to increase your return, you have to pay less for the bond. So what they have done, you're going to pay $1,218.70 for the William S. Hart bond, but only $1,105 for the Goldman Sachs bond. So a difference of what, about $118 per bond. That's a pretty significant difference. The price of $1,105 leads to a yield annual rate of return of 3.8% for the Goldman Sachs, but the much higher price for the William S. Hart bond leads to an annual rate of return of only 2.65%. So the idea is the riskier the bond, and the single A bond is much more risky, the higher the return investors are going to want to earn. So they're going to be only willing to pay less for it in order to get their return up. So that's why these two bonds, even though they're similar in maturity and identical in coupon rate, that's why they have a much different price, because investors of the riskier bond want to earn a higher return. The way to do that is to pay less for it. So they're paying less than the William S. Hart buyers, who are only earning 2.6%. So I want to talk about what determines the risk of a corporation. So whenever Fitch is evaluating Goldman Sachs and the William S. Hart California, that must be a high school, um, and they're raising bonds to perhaps build a stadium, or issuing bonds to raise money to build a stadium, for instance. I don't know exactly what that's for. But anyway, it's a government issued bond or municipality issued bond. Um, So when Fitch is evaluating the corporations and the government entities to determine these ratings, what kinds of things are they examining to come up with that grade? So what determines the bond rating or the grade that Fitch gives them? Well, the first is how financially strong is the company or the government entity. And I'm just going to say company. So does it already have a lot of debt? Is it heavily debt ridden already? If it is, then it's riskier and it's just going to add more debt on top of it. That's why they're being evaluated, because they're contemplating issuing additional bonds. Is it a growing industry that the company operates in? Is there room for expansion and growth, or is it a stagnant industry? Will they be able to generate profits? Is it profitable or operating at a loss? So they'll look at things like that. And for a government issued bond, they'll look at the ability of the government entity to generate revenue. So for instance, sometimes they issue bonds to build toll bridges, and obviously then they charge tolls to use those bridges. Well, charging a toll is a revenue generator, and so they would charge the toll to raise money to pay the bond holders the interest and the principal. They'll also look at the maturity of the debt. If it's a long-term bond, then it's riskier, because it's more difficult to forecast whether a company will be around in 30 years to make bond payments than in, let's say, just 3 years. A lot can happen in 30 years to cause a company to go bankrupt, and it's more difficult to forecast that. And then specific features of the bonds. So, for instance, is there a sinking fund? If there is, that generally means the bond is perceived as less risky, because if there's not a sinking fund, you just have to rely on the ability of the company to make money and have enough money to pay that huge principal at maturity. If there's a sinking fund, it typically means the company is perhaps more conservative, more willing to take the bondholders' wishes into account, and they're steadily saving money to have the principal amount that they owe at maturity. So if yes, that equals less risk for the bondholders. Is it callable? If the answer is yes, that means there's more risk for the bondholders, because a bond that's not callable will be outstanding until maturity unless the company goes bankrupt. A bond that is callable can be called in at the whim of the issuer, and that usually happens when the interest rates are declining. So a bond would get called in, the bondholders would receive cash for that, which they'd have to reinvest in a market that has lower rates. And then, is there collateral? If yes, that typically means less risk for the bondholders. And then the last topic, I've already talked about it a tiny bit, but I want to discuss who issues bonds. First are corporations, and I've already talked about that a lot. But also the US government, and they issue what are known as treasury bonds or treasury securities. Sometimes I'll just call them treasuries, but they have different maturity dates. If they have a maturity of less than 1 year, I'll actually do it just like this. So less than 1 year, they're called treasury bills. If they're between 1 year, so if they're greater than a year, how am I going to do that? I'll just go 1 year to 10 years. They're called treasury notes. And if they're over 10 years, they're called treasury bonds. And there are different specifics, like Treasury bills are what's called they're they're called discounted securities. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. So Treasury bills are discounted. What that means is they don't actually pay an interest rate. You buy them at a discount below par or maturity value. Remember, par is also called principal or maturity value. I typically call it par, but I don't think I actually called it that in the previous lectures. And since the U.S. government needs to raise so much money, um, Treasury bills typically have a $10,000 face value. And so, oops, that shouldn't be apostrophe. Below its $10,000 face value or par value. So you might pay $9,920 for it. And then in a month it might mature and you'd get $10,000 for it. So the return that you generated would be the $80, the difference between what you paid for it and what you received when it matured. And so they don't actually have a coupon rate attached to Treasury bills like Treasury bonds do. Treasury securities are considered to be the least risky securities in the world. The reason being, the U.S. government just prints money to pay the owners of Treasury securities. And thus far, they've not defaulted, they being the U.S. government. And so what would be interesting to do, we know that Goldman Sachs bond, it was generating a yield of, let's see, was it 3.811%? And it had 10 years until maturity. So it would be interesting to know what the yield would be on a 10-year government treasury. So what I'm going to do is just try to find that information. And I know they have some government securities, treasuries here. So, and I wasn't sure if they had the 10-year one, but they do. So the yield on a 10-year U.S. government bond is 2.1% today. Yesterday it was a little higher. So like I said, interest rates fluctuate all the time. So the yield on this extremely low risk U.S. Treasury is only 2.1%, not a whole lot more than my certificates deposit that I have. The yield on this much higher risk Goldman Sachs bond is almost twice as much, 3.81%. And it's not because it has a different maturity. They both mature in 10 years. It's because it has a much higher risk rank than U.S. government securities, which have a triple A rank. This is only a single A rank, and there's a big difference between a triple A and a single A in terms of risk. So what was that, 3.8%? I don't remember the other decimals. The U.S. government also issues these things called TIPS, and that stands for Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. Typically, U.S. Treasury notes and bonds are fixed rate securities, so they get issued, they have a fixed coupon rate, and it doesn't change over the life of the security. But TIPS don't work quite the same way. TIPS are adjusted every 6 months, I believe, to reflect the current level of inflation. And so what happens is every 6 months the coupon rate can change on this TIP, as can the maturity value. So when you buy a TIP, you're guaranteed to earn at least the inflation rate. If inflation isn't extremely rampant, because they only adjust for inflation every 6 months, I believe. So if inflation was at a certain level and then the 6 month time period occurred and they adjusted the inflation, the coupon rate and the par value on the tip, and then the very next day inflation doubled, well, they're not going to adjust your coupon rate and your principal amount until another 6 months from now. So in that case, you'd kind of be out of luck, but that doesn't really happen in the United States. Now, with a tip, you're not going to earn much more than inflation. And I don't know about you, but for most of my money, I want to earn quite a bit more than inflation. That's the only real way to boost your purchasing power, to outpace inflation. And I want to boost my purchasing power by a fair amount, so I need to earn quite a bit more than inflation. And a tip isn't going to do that for me. Maybe after I've retired and I'm 75 years old and I'm not likely to live a whole lot longer, maybe then I'd put my money in tips, but probably not all of it even then. I don't think tips are a bad idea, I just don't think they're right for me. At least not right now in my life. So back to who issues securities. So the U.S. government does. There are U.S. government agencies that also issue securities, and I don't want to get into this too much, but the main U.S. government agency that does this is called the Government National Mortgage Association. And what they do is purchase mortgages from banks all around the country, and so they could buy my mortgage, and rather than my paying my original lender, I would pay the Ginnie Mae mortgages. Well, I called it something different. The abbreviation for this is GNMA, so you oftentimes hear this referred to as Ginnie Mae. So if Ginnie Mae bought my mortgage, rather than my making my payments to the original lender, I'd make them to Ginnie Mae. And what Ginnie Mae does is bundles all these mortgages that they've purchased, and basically every month then they're collecting payments from all the people who had borrowed that money, and they repackage it and sell shares in it, and basically I can buy a Ginnie Mae security and then invest in other people's mortgages. The fourth group that issues bonds would be municipalities, and that's what we saw with that William S. Hurt California High School. So basically states and local government issue this to build bridges, toll roads, buildings, I'll just say etc. Like a famous bridge that was financed with a municipality bond, municipal bond actually, and they call them munis, was the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. If y'all remember, I guess it was back in the 1950s when they built the original Tacoma Narrows Bridge, and it then got caught with wind shears and started rippling and crashed. And they had, I don't remember exactly what that stands for. I'm going to Google it really quickly and see if I can find out. I don't normally Google while I'm making videos. Hopefully this will work. Oh, here we go. Oh, nope, it's not there. Anyway, they financed it with with municipal bonds, and normally when they do that, they like to assign a, what does he call it, an acronym, and the acronym that they used was stood for Washington something, and I just can't remember what the HOOPS stands for. I will look it up and I'll get back to you on that. But it was abbreviated WHOOPS, which seemed kind of appropriate for what happened to that particular bridge. I believe they used bonds to finance the building of the student rec center at Western. And then the last thing I'll say, and I had mentioned this already, when municipalities issue bonds, they can issue two different types. The first is what they call a revenue specific bond, and that would be like a toll bridge. The interest and principal on that bond is paid with revenue that's generated from the specific thing the bond was issued to pay for. If the toll bridge doesn't generate enough tolls to make the interest and principal payments, then they're not paid in their entirety. That would be a riskier type bond than this next one, which is called a general obligation bond. The interest and principal on a general obligation bond is generated from the municipality's general ability to raise taxes, from property taxes and things like that. So a revenue specific bond is more risky than a general obligation bond for if you buy one of those issued by a municipality.